Hey guys, my name is Erwin McManus, and you're listening to the Mind Shift podcast. I have a few exciting announcements before you dive into this episode where me and my dad were back in Malaysia with an amazing guy named Kevin Liu. My bad, it's actually not me and my dad and Kevin Liu, it's just me and my dad on stage at an amazing conference. Guys, pick up this book. It has just come out. And this is our first book on our own publishing company, and the logo is right there at the bottom, Arena, which is very, very exciting. So order the book, 7frequencies.com. It will ship right away. And you can also take our 15-minute assessment where you dive in to find out and discover your primary communication frequencies. It's really exciting. We've been developing this for a while, so I want you guys to check it out. And also, we have an amazing thing coming up called the Arena Conference, live in Los Angeles. We have an amazing lineup of speakers from Brendon Bouchard to Erwin McManus to Ali Webb, a few special guests who are going to be popping in like Jay Glazer, John Gordon, Jamie Kern-Lima, and some amazing, amazing people. Go to thearenasummit.com and register today. And while you're at it, you might as well just join the Arena. You can just upgrade your account, get the full year membership, and dive into all of the amazing content that we've been building for the last 2 years. All right, guys, enjoy this episode on us talking about who knows what.
I think too many pastors are just thirsty for fame, and their family loses in that battle. And so I just think it's just a matter of being a human first.
How do you know it's the voice of God?
God's voice and our inner voice shouldn't be separated. You grow in your intimacy with God so that your inner voice always resonates with God's voice. Creativity is the natural result of spirituality. Everyone said no.
Where in the scriptures did you kind of build this ideology from?
I couldn't understand how you could not see the creative essence of human beings from the beginning of the story in the scriptures. And then I looked at the church and I went, wow, the church looks like the least creative institution in the world. Something has to change.
You are listening to the Mind Shift podcast. My name is Erwin McManus, and I'm here with my dad, Erwin McManus. How are you, Dad?
I'm doing great. How about you?
I'm doing well, but I feel a little bit awkward because there's a lot of people in the room.
Well, we are in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia.
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah. Amazing. Okay, so
this is the first leg of our global tour.
Yep, the only stop.
We're a one-legged table. It's good.
We are. What's a one-legged table?
One you don't want to eat on.
Oh, okay. Are you jet-lagged?
I'm jet-lagged at night, but I feel great in the daytime.
Okay, so this is going to be rough. Okay, no, here we go. So a couple of things. We started this podcast about 7 or 8 years ago now.
Yep.
In the beginning of a really hectic situation that we had dealt with. You had just been diagnosed with cancer, and you were in the middle of writing one of my favorite books you've ever written, called The Last Arrow, talking about leaving nothing for the next life. This idea that we empty ourselves and give everything that we have to the life that we're living, because tomorrow's never promised. And I still remember the restaurant that you took us to kind of share with us this moment that you were having, and it was heartbreaking for me. And not shortly after, I came to you and I said, hey, I am not a great communicator. I'm the guy who can write in his journal and listen to Spotify. My gifts and talents are a little bit different than yours. Is there any way that I could sit and have a conversation with you and do a podcast and ask you all of the questions that I wish I could ask you if you don't make it through this? Which is a little bit morbid, I think, to like reflect on. But it was one of those beautiful moments where you said, yes, absolutely, let's sit down and you ask me any question that you would like. And so that's kind of the origin of this podcast, and we've been doing it for about 7 or 8 years now. And he hasn't thrown me out of his house yet. So I think we're doing okay.
We're doing great. No, I remember when you asked me to do the podcast. One, I had never thought about doing a podcast. I would have never done a podcast. But you said there's so many questions that if you had died, would have been left unanswered for me.
Yeah.
And could I ask those questions on a podcast so you could share them with the world? And I don't know a lot of fathers who have sons who say, I want to spend more time with you. I'm an adult now, but I want to still learn from you. And I feel that you have things to share, not just with you, but you were saying you have things to share with the world. And I want to make sure you do that.
Yeah, I think a lot of it came from our relationship. You from an early age, probably 10 or 11, when I came to you and said, I don't know what I believe in. And do you remember that?
Oh, I do.
What was it like?
Yeah, we were driving through a small town called Whittier, and because I remember exactly where it was.
Okay.
And you're about 10 years old, and you said, "Hey, Dad, I don't know if I would be a Christian if I had not been raised in a Christian home." And when you said that, it kind of made me a little nervous, but I just stayed calm, and I said, well, why is that, buddy? And you said, I have so many doubts and questions, so many doubts and questions. And I said, oh, doubts and questions, those are okay. I have those too. And you seemed surprised that I had doubts and questions too. But I was still nervous because, I'm a dad, and I want my son to believe deeply in Jesus. I want him to have that relationship, but I didn't want to overreact and panic. And so I said, as we drove, I was real quiet, and I said, so what are you going to do? And you clearly were thinking, and then you said, well, I've already met God, so what can I do? and I said, yeah, I know what you mean. And I thought it was such a beautiful thing to have this clear sense that you've met God, and also this clear sense that you have so many doubts and questions, and faith was still a struggle, a battle, and a journey.
Yeah, it was interesting. So the next few years were quite a journey. I mean, you shipped me off to different, can I tell them everything? Look, here's the thing. He is a great man and an amazing pastor, and maybe the way he raised me was a little bit hippie. Right?
I just thought it was
avant-garde.
I like that, avant-garde.
Avant-garde,
Yes.
Yeah. My mother almost killed you a few times. But basically, I just had this really, I think, deep desire to go on a journey and search and figure this out and learn about all types of religions and ways of life. And you were really generous with helping me go through that journey and not doing it alone. And I would go to these different places and study and learn, and then always come back and have these conversations with you. So this idea of asking questions, of doubting and having these concerns, nothing was ever off the table.
No, I raised you, taking you to Buddhist temples, and whether it was a mosque or a Hindu retreat center, or I took the Shinto temple in Tokyo. I wanted to expose you to every religion and worldview in the world possible. I didn't want you to feel like you had to leave the relationship with me to go explore things that you needed to explore. I wanted to be the explorer with you. So I went ahead, just exposed you to everything. Because if Jesus is true, and I believe he is, then I don't have to worry about exposing you to anything, because you'll find that truth in it as long as you're sincere. So it was a crazy journey. So yes, you went through an upbringing that was different.
Okay, so let's start there though, because I think that's a really counterintuitive way of raising. So I bill you for all of my trauma and therapy. Because in the U.S. we go to a lot of therapy because we're more broken. But that's not really normal. And my mother was like a very devout Southern Baptist Christian.
Her view was different, yes.
What would her view be?
You do what I tell you.
Amen and amen. There was God, and then there was my mother.
I think it might be more of an Asian approach toward parenting.
Yes.
I tell you what to do. You don't ask questions. So, you just obey.
Yes.
And Jesus is Lord. And pray before you eat.
Yes.
And read your Bible every day, and go to church. And just do what I tell you, and you're going to be okay.
And say hi to every single person in the room, and there's manners, and I don't think I called an adult by their first name until I was actually an adult.
No, she taught you, yes sir, yes ma'am.
Yeah. And so that could not have been easy, that conversation, or was it easy?
No, we just had a different view.
No, what was that like though? That conversation with you and her on how you were going to let me ask questions.
It was challenging because, as a parent, you just desperately want your kids to make good choices. And sometimes you feel like the questions are the actions. And it's almost like sometimes we're taught that questions are defiance. questions are our children questioning us rather than just asking the questions that have to be asked. And so I think we struggled. Kim gave you all the foundational things that were so important that I see you still take on in your life, and some real critical disciplines. And I think that I maybe what I contributed was teaching you to explore and to have an open mind, to be imaginative, and to not be afraid of pursuing truth anywhere. And the combination, I think made a pretty amazing human being.
Thank you.
And other than the therapy that you still need.
But we talk about choices in that conversation there, because there were moments where the questions maybe were seen as the choices, but you let me ask the questions. But then there were seasons of my life where I was making really, I wouldn't say bad choices, I would say not great choices. And I paid the price for all those choices. And we were pretty open about that for the most part. And I think you knew when I wasn't doing well. And I think Mom knew when I wasn't in a great place. And I was always on a faith journey. And that was from, I started at a really young age and kind of into my early 20s. And there's even moments now where we sit and talk about these conversations about God and the experience of God and hearing the voice of God. And that was a huge thing. Like, how do you hear the voice of God? I think when I was 10 or 11, I was so confused because I was in this, you go to whatever version of like Village Bible camp in church. Do you have like kids camp, like church camp? It's so confusing. Yeah, I gave my life to Jesus every session. I've been saved like in the thousands of times.
Yep. It's interesting. Before we came up here, we were in the back room with some new friends, and this gentleman who I actually immediately really liked, to be honest with you. And some people he just really, resonate with quickly. And he asked such an honest question. He goes, I don't know if I hear God's voice. And so before we came up here, we were talking about hearing God's voice. And I think you're growing up, I talked a lot about hearing God's voice. And I remember you would ask me, Dad, how do you know God's voice? How do you hear God's voice? How do you hear God's voice? And one time we sent you to this camp up in the mountains. It was a Mosaic camp from our church.
You're going to tell that story.
I'm going to tell that story.
Of all the stories. You look bad.
I am going to tell that.
I got a couple of stories about you then.
It's a great story. And so I get a call the first day. Here, I'm the pastor of Mosaic.
How old am I?
You're, I don't know, 11, 12?
Okay.
10?
11, 12. I did not know what I was doing.
So he's at this camp, and I get a call saying, you need to come up to the camp. Aaron wants to go home. And I said, well, he can stay. He goes, no, you don't understand.
No, I'm not allowed to stay.
He's not allowed to stay. And that's different than wants to go home.
Oh,
and I said, what happened? He said he punched one of the kids.
Lightly, soft.
But he punched the biggest kid, so I was a little proud. But, if he had punched a little kid, I'd have been really disappointed, but he punched the biggest kid. So I'm like, okay. I love the fact that you're reaching up. And so I have to drive an hour and a half, 2 hours to this camp, and I bring Aaron in, and most kids are going to lie to you about why they're in trouble, but not him. Like, he just comes in. I said, okay, buddy, what happened? And he said, I said, they're telling me you punched him. He goes, I did punch him. And I said, okay. They said that you won't apologize. And he said, they're right. I will not apologize. And I said, okay, if you could just apologize, it would, we could get past this. He goes, no. He goes, I know how the system works. You do something wrong, you ask for forgiveness, you repent, and then everyone forgives you.
I would never talk to you with that tone.
And and then you get to move on. He goes, but I'm not going to ask for forgiveness. And I said, well, why? He goes, because I'm not sorry. And then you said, well, I am sorry about one thing. And I said, what's that? He goes, I didn't get to hit him twice. So I'm like, okay, how do I help him process this? And I said, buddy, why would you want to punch this kid? And he goes, he said something about Mom. And I said, he did what? He goes, he said something about my mom. And if he says something about my mom again, I'll punch him in the face again. And I'm like, yeah, come on. And this is the son I raised. And so anyway, I can't get him to apologize. I can't get him to stay. So he packs his stuff, but he wants me to help him pack, but I won't help him pack. And he's packing. He goes, I know what you're doing. You're just making me do it myself so that I'll change my mind, but I'm not going to change my mind. He was, a little stubborn, and grabbed the stuff, and then he has to drag it up the hill. I won't help him carry his luggage. He goes, I know, you're not helping me because you want me to change my mind. I go, that's right. You change your mind? No. So he's dragging his luggage. We finally get to the car, and we had this interesting moment. I said, hey, before we leave, can we just go sit down on these rocks? And we sit down. And I said, buddy, we're going to pray. And I just want you to listen to see if God says anything to you. So we got quiet. And we prayed. And then I said, did God say anything to you? He said, yes. I said, what did God say? He said, I should stay, make the relationship right, and stay here for the week. And I said, that's amazing. He goes, I just want to be clear. That is what God said, and I'm not going to do it.
It was really a journey. It was a journey.
And I said, I don't care. All I care about, Aaron, do you know what happened? The creator of the universe spoke to you and told you specifically what he wanted of you. I said, now this is the way it's going to work. If you treasure what he said and trust it, you will become better and better at hearing his voice. If you reject his voice and disobey, his voice will become silent to you. And one day you'll be deaf to God's voice, and you won't even believe you ever heard God's voice. I said, but that choice is yours. And he said, yeah, it is, and I'm not going to stay. So we walked to the car, and all of a sudden, this really cool guy who was a counselor walks down the hill, or up the hill, and he goes, Aaron, are you leaving? He knew Aaron was leaving. And he goes, yeah, I'm leaving. And he goes, man, I was hoping you'd stay so we could hang out and spend some time together. And Aaron goes, yeah, I think I'll stay. All it took was someone else coming in. And I think that's the way God shows up sometimes. But I do want to highlight that because that is a moment that I remember you hearing the voice of God and knowing it was God speaking to you. And I think those moments are the moments we should hold on to when it seems that God is silent.
So I have two questions for you.
Yeah.
Because I feel like that story's been, I've heard you tell that story a lot of different versions of that.
But not for years.
Not different versions, different times.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'm a mediocre villain, and sometimes I actually jumped across a picnic table and hit him. It was like a ninja, like an aerial move. But I would say
we don't want to celebrate the violence. Maybe a little.
It was a good hit. Yeah. But the story is unique to me because I feel like it's always been a reflection of my journey with God. That there's always been something that I've been fighting internally and wrestling with consistently, and then I've always been battling that whether or not I'll choose to hear and listen to the voice of God. There's been seasons of my life where I have not been able to hear the voice of God, and there's other seasons where I feel like I'm moved by maybe the Spirit more. And I'm able to maybe attune closer to the voice of God than others. But is there a way of, I think there's two questions, is like, how do you know it's the voice of God? Right? And then if you feel that the voice of God is, maybe you've turned that off, that ability to hear it, to hear God, how do you turn that back on?
Yeah, I think that when you're young in your spiritual journey, there's a dynamic because you've never been aware of God's voice in your life. See, I actually think you hear God's voice long before you actually know Jesus, that God is already speaking to you, because all of the universe is designed to echo God's voice. And so creation is speaking to you, your conscience is speaking to you, like everything around you is speaking to you. And I think God creates the universe. He spoke into existence, and it's still speaking what he has to say. But we're not always aware of it. And so when we're new in our faith, we can almost like find his voice in such a unique way because it's the first time we become aware of it. But I think as we become mature in our faith, God's voice and our inner voice shouldn't be separated. That you grow in your intimacy with God so that your inner voice always resonates with God's voice. And And so I think there's a maturity where you're not going, oh, God just spoke to me. The maturity is, this is who I am. This is what I do. And so I don't expect audible voices from God. I expect a deep inner voice from God. And sometimes you have to develop the muscle. I had a year where I told myself it was my year of yes. And every time I felt that God was speaking to me, I just said yes and did it, even if it was crazy. And maybe 30, 40% of them probably were not what God was saying. I figured that out as, I was crashing and burning. But my sincerity and my motivation was pure. And I think that when you trust God's voice and you say, God, if I sense you speaking to me, I'm going to move with it. You actually begin to develop a sensitivity to his voice. You actually begin to pay attention to it. And here's an easy way of doing it. Whenever that inner voice tells you to do something that is more noble or more honorable or more generous or more courageous, whenever that inner voice calls you to the higher version of you, just accept it as God's voice. And you will actually begin to be more in tune to God's voice in your life.
Have you ever been confused about what may or may not be God's voice in your life?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
What's that look like?
Confusion.
Yeah.
I think my biggest sense of uncertainty when I think God is speaking to me and I'm not sure is probably more whenever it speaks into an area of real weakness in my life. And there's certain things I think that when, if I get asked to do it, it's easy for me. But when you have wounds from your childhood and you have a low sense of self, and I actually think that God calls me to bigger things than I'm willing to call myself into. And so my biggest struggles are when I feel like God is inviting me to something that I don't feel like I deserve, and I actually don't deserve it, but I don't feel worthy of receiving it. And I remember the day I came home and told Kim, we were sleeping on the floor because I wouldn't buy a bed. My income was like $10,000 to $12,000 a year in the United States for about 10 years. And I came home one day and I told Kim, I think God spoke to me and he told me that I'm free to create wealth. And Kim, we'd been married 10 years. She goes, you can create wealth? And I go, yeah, I've always been capable of it. She goes, well, get to it. And because we've been living in dismal poverty. And the reason we're living in poverty wasn't because God called us to be poor. We were living in poverty because I didn't feel like I was worthy of success and worthy of more. And so a lot of my internal conflicts with God have actually been God trying to restructure my identity rather than, Erwin, do this or do this. It's, Erwin, understand this about who you are in me. Those are the deeper conversations I think God wants to have with us. He's not utilitarian. I say, I don't think God's like a puppet master going, do this, do this, do this, do this. I think God is like, become this, become this, become this, and then do what you want.
That's an interesting idea. Because you would say that you are a strong believer of do something until you feel like God has called you to something specific. That
yes.
Just the stay and waiting of maybe this thing, I think maybe in the Western world, maybe it's an LA thing where you will hear a lot of young, I think, people will say, I'm just waiting until I hear the voice of God.
Yeah, waiting on God, I think, is one of the most distorted theological positions I've ever heard. When people go, I'm just waiting on the Lord, I'm just waiting on the Lord, I'm just waiting on the Lord. The only times that phrase is used in the Bible is when people want to retreat. And God says, you need to wait on me because you're going to run backwards and I want you to go forward. Most people act like you need to wait on the Lord because you're moving too fast. There's actually pretty much nowhere in the Bible where someone is moving too fast and God can't keep up with them. It's everywhere where God is calling us forward and we're too afraid to take one more step. And so when you should wait on the Lord is when you're ready to run backwards. And it's not a spiritual excuse for paralysis, apathy, or passivity. There's always a forward with God. And, God is spirit, but we act like God is rock. And God is always moving, and he's moving toward the future. And if you're stagnant, you can't possibly be moving in intimacy with God, because God is always moving.
Hey guys, it's me again. This is an ad. Since we don't do ads, we just talk about the projects that we are building. And this new book, The 7 Frequencies of Communication, has been our dream project for the last few years. We've been building the Arena community. We've been building this podcast called Mindshift. And now we are excited to announce that this book is now available. So don't waste any time. Buy the book, buy it for a friend, and also take the assessment on the7frequencies.com.
Okay, where do you want to go from here?
Oh,
We have a
one,
couple
we should have
ideas.
set it up, we could do some Q&A, but especially with some of the pastors who are here,
We absolutely can do that.
which I think
Yeah.
would be really, really fun.
I imagine someone over here could figure out a mic and bring it out to the room.
One thing, maybe Pastor Kevin, can we maybe have you be the? Oh, that's awesome. But I actually wanted to talk about for a minute about like why did the Mosaic start?
Right.
A little bit, because there's so many churches in the world, and you have to sometimes wonder like why start a new one or why do something different? And I remember about 30 years ago, I was in the mountains of North Carolina laying on a bridge over a river because I'd been a part of this leadership center with Billy Graham's brother-in-law, and they did an assessment, and they told everyone in the room, you're perfectly crafted to be a pastor. And then they told me, you are not crafted to be a pastor. You should not be one. And I went out this bridge, I laid on it, and I said, God, why would you make me this way if you want me to do that thing? And do I need a new career, a new direction? And I felt really lost. And what I heard in my soul was, if I wanted the church to remain the same, I would call the same kind of leader. But if I want the church to change, I have to call a different kind of leader. I'm not calling you to be who they are. I'm calling you to create a church designed around who you are. And I think sometimes we underplay the fact that God expresses himself differently through different people. And a part of the way God does unique things is he calls us in our uniqueness to create something different. And a huge part of it for me was like my whole view of the movement of Jesus. And when I would hear people, I don't know if this happens here, Pastor Kevin, but at Mosaic, people would always come who'd been Christians for a long time. Where do I get discipled? Like, where's your commitment to discipleship? And it's like people have been Christians for 20 years, and their first question is, I want to be discipled. And I'm like, if you've been a Christian for 20 years and you still need to be discipled, you're like a factory defect. It's not going to work, And
We like friends, though.
well, we like friends.
We like
sorry.
people. Yeah.
But here's the thing: in the Bible, okay, if you believe the Bible, and I do, discipleship is something you do with people who don't believe in God or in Jesus. Not something you do with people who already believe in God and in Jesus. Because Jesus says, go and make disciples of all nations. There were no Christians in the nations. But we take that verse, go make disciples, and go, you see, you're supposed to just spend your whole life helping Christians mature. But actually, when Jesus says go make disciples, that's a mandate of something that can only happen if you're affecting people who don't believe in Jesus. So whatever discipleship is, it's supposed to happen before we give our lives to Jesus. And the momentum of that carries all the way through. And so part of the reason I started Mosaic is I actually thought Christianity was very self-indulgent, that we create churches for Christians. And it just seemed to me to be kind of tragic that we didn't have churches who saw our role as to be the towel that washes people's feet. And so I wanted to create a space for people who were so committed to those who didn't know Jesus. And my prayer when we started Mosaic is, God, we want to be the research and development arm of Christianity. We don't need to succeed. We could fail 1,000 times if in that failure we can find the one thing the church around the world needs. And that made, for me, Mosaic a really beautiful space. And then I had so many friends who were atheists and agnostics and Buddhists and so many different religions. And I wanted to create a space where they could genuinely explore and see if Jesus was real. So that really was the beginning of Mosaic. We ended up being known around the world for creativity, but creativity wasn't our passion. People were our passion. And creativity was a necessary methodology to reach the world. How do you reach a world of creatives if you're not creative? How do you reach a world of innovators if you're not innovative? You were going to say something.
No, you as a little kid, I mean, growing up, you would have, I mean, probably the first 1,000 people that came to Mosaic were in our home on a Saturday morning at a thing called, what was it called? Welcome to Mosaic? No, it was called.
Yeah, the first 3,000 people that joined Mosaic all had lunch at our house.
But what was that thing called? It was called Life in Christ.
I think it was Life in Christ.
Yeah, and you would go over these core values that you had set. And I remember as like a little kid, and this is how defiant I probably was, even just early on. I remember believing that I didn't agree with the core values. And now it's really funny because now I get to travel the world talking about these core values that I believe so like vehemently in my soul, and take these into even to like mainstream places around the world that is really unique. But one of my favorite core values, which I hated as a young person, I didn't agree because I didn't believe that I was a creative person, is creativity is the natural result of spirituality. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, we established 5 core values. The first 4 were easy. Mission is why the church exists. People go, oh yeah, that makes sense. Love is the context for all mission. You go, oh, love, that's awesome. Structure must submit to spirit. People going, okay.
That's my favorite one.
Yeah, relevance to culture is not optional. All right. But creativity is the natural result of spirituality. Everyone said no. In fact, I had a group of like pastors and theologians, and one of the key ones, actually the key one, said, no, creativity is not natural to the human experience. It's not natural to spirituality. He said, humans are worker ants. They just need a task to make them feel meaningful. And then his associate said, for you to say everyone's creative is to put undue pressure on people. And then this other expert said, when you say that everyone's creative, you're going to create anarchy and chaos. If everyone's a creative, who's going to do the work? By the way, if you're really creative, you do the work. And so sociologically and theologically, no one agreed with me. And I even called my brother because I needed someone to agree with me. And he said, yeah, no. And
but where was that based?
What?
Where was that based? Where in the scriptures did you kind of build this ideology from?
Well, because Genesis 1 is all about the creative act from God. You cannot know who God is outside of his creative action. If God did not create, we would know nothing about God. And then God says, you are created in my image and likeness. And so when we look at how God translated onto us who he is, there is no way a human being cannot be a creative actor. And then when you begin to look at even the way God designed Adam and Eve and how they name all the animals, God could have, look, most leaders are so micromanagers, they would have never let Adam name all the animals. They would have said, I'm going to tell you the names, you write them down. But God says to Adam, name all the animals. To be able to name every species is an act of unbelievable creativity and imagination. And on top of that, to be able to remember all those names without a computer tells you that there was a genius inside of the human that we have underestimated. And so I look at just the opening of Genesis. God wants us to be these beautiful partners with him in the creative process, which I think is really pretty beautiful and extraordinary. So I couldn't understand how you could not see the creative essence of human beings from the beginning of the story in the scriptures. And then I looked at the church and I went, wow, the church looks like the least creative institution in the world. And we're representing the most creative person in the universe, God himself. Something has to change. God is not holding on to the past. God is creating the future. God is not afraid of imagining what does not exist. God is the progenitor of imagining what doesn't exist. And then it says, in faith, right, is confidence in things unseen, right, and assurance of things hoped for. And so what we know is that God calls us to a life of faith, and faith creates the future. And I'm going to stop here, but do you want to see if they have any questions?
Yeah. Do you have any questions?
All right, my name's Joshua from Okinawa, Japan, and I had a question about family, because your relationship with your son is admirable. And as young ministers, as people in ministry, my question is, how do you maintain a healthy relationship with your family and still serve and do business and all these things at the same time? Because right now your relationship looks like, and it seems so close, but how do you keep that closeness with everything you do?
That was what we're going to make the subject of our podcast at first.
I know.
Was the relationships between father and son. I have the most extraordinary son on the face of this earth. I have been given the gift of having Aaron as my son.
I appreciate that.
And he makes life more interesting. He makes me better. He forces me to grapple with issues and problems that I would probably ignore.
And to answer questions, to actually answer the question.
And he is my greatest friend.
Oh, I appreciate that.
But talk a little bit about how we end up having this friendship.
I don't know. How did we have this friendship? I think it was this refusal of you to like let go and give up, and also me on the journey going, even the good and the bad times, always just picking up the phone and calling. I think it was always understood that religion was not the basis of our relationship, and that it was a core foundation of our connection. But that no matter, because I felt really uncomfortable in the church. That was I always believed in God. That young Carl Jung quote of I don't believe in God, I know God, really hit hard with me, because it was like this thing of like I didn't always know how to explain it, but I did know that there was this feeling and this reality that was really hard for me to ignore, right? And every time I tried to run away, it seemed that it just ran with me. And so he just created a space where I could be honest and open, and he was just always willing to risk his reputation on my mess. And so there was that. His career as a pastor was not something that he prioritized over our relationship. You know, there was a season of when I was 17, 18, and I was just gone away to college, and I'd come back, and his best friend at the time, one of his best friends, was Denzel Washington's security guard. And he's just a big man, big boy. And I noticed that it wasn't just James, it was all his guys were around my dad outside of one of the campuses on that Sunday. And I'd come in from college, and I brought a bunch of friends with me. And I asked James, like, why are you so close to my dad? And he was like, you should talk to your dad. And we went through a season where there was like a group of guys, men and women from around the country, but mostly in LA, that were trying to kill him. And do you remember MySpace? This is aging me so hard. But there was a MySpace with a countdown of like the day they were going to kill him on stage. And so he had explained it, and he's not so good at the explaining part, the giving the answers part, to me. And he never wanted to share the burden or the weight of what I think giving his entire life to Jesus really was at times, you know, and the sacrifice. And so that season of life, it became really hard, because it was just tumultuous opposition from the, you know, on the university level, to my friends, to our family, to people on the internet, to people showing up at my house when I was at college, my little sister calling me saying, there's men outside trying to get in, I need help. And so I think in that season of life, we got the closest we ever maybe had been, because he had always said, if there's a choice between you and the church, I'm gonna always choose my family. So you got to let me know if there's ever that moment where it becomes too hard. And I don't know if we let you know, but I think the world kind of let you know that was a really hard season of life.
Yeah.
And I kind of had grown up in those like early or like late teens, early 20s with this maybe false reality that everyone who was a Christian wanted to kill us. And it really was life-changing when, you know, however you feel about Hillsong and the messiness that was a safe place for me, because there was people who actually liked other Christians. You know, they didn't speak bad about people publicly. They spoke, oh, like, we love your dad, we love his books, we love your family. How can we make this be a safe place for you? And so that was and I was in a nightclub when that happened. But that was like a pivotal moment where I think maybe God, it was one of those seasons of life where I felt like I was running away from God, and God kind of ran with me. And I realized that there was maybe work left to be done in the church. And it really brought me back in to kind of go, there's places to build there's a place to build beautiful things for people who feel so lost. And so it just took time. It took a decade and a half, almost 2 decades. So I think I commend him on his patience. He's a very patient man that has a very impatient son. And I think it was that. It was patience, and maybe this refusal to let go and to let my reputation affect his, and just always going, that's my son, I'm going to be with him through the good and the bad.
I have a question.
All right.
I'm privileged to be let into your world a bit, but Pastor, sometimes how Aaron disagrees with you.
Sometimes?
Wait, what do you say?
Sometimes how you disagree with me. I'm just disagreeing with the sometimes.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to keep my friendship with Aaron.
Is there a question there?
And actually, I want to speak on behalf, if I can, for a lot of Asian parents. I don't know how you deal with those moments. And it's not even private. Sometimes it's us around. But you handle it so well. For me, I would have just smacked my son's head, I think. So how did you react like that? I really like to know. I think a lot of people would like to know. Thank you, sir.
So what he's saying is I'm disrespectful. How have you managed my disrespect?
You are disrespectful. I think that I deserve greater respect. No.
I gave you my whole life.
Yeah, I don't think Aaron's disrespectful. I think he's earned the right to disagree by walking with me and doing life together. And we shed sweat, blood, and tears together. He has earned the right to disagree. And if you want your children to become your friends, then you have to give them the right to disagree. And and a lot of people don't know this. Like there's a little season in my journey as a pastor where I became a little bit well known, and then I disappeared for 6 years. I went to the publisher and my agent said, I'm not writing any more books. I stopped speaking at conferences. All I did was Mosaic in a very private space. And I did that because I knew that level of celebrity was killing my son. And it wasn't worth it. And I think, unfortunately, too many pastors are just too thirsty for fame and for power, and they're addicted to it, and their family loses in that battle. And it's just, I've just never had that thirst. And but I always knew, if I'm not your pastor, you'll get a great pastor. If I'm not that person for you, but there's no other father for Aaron and Mariah. They get one shot to have a dad who loves them. And that's the greatest responsibility of my life. And the same with Kim. We've been married 40 years, and marriage isn't easy. You have to work hard to stay married. And even more than that, you have to work harder to stay in love with each other in that marriage. I'm not in a marriage of obligation. I love Kim, and she loves me, and we work hard at rekindling that love and throughout our relationship. And so I just think it's just a matter of being a human first, and then being a pastor or whatever else other role you have. Yeah, I feel sad that many people as parents are estranged from their kids, or don't actually have a deep relationship with their parents or their children. And there's a reason for that. If you're not good at human relationships, you're not going to be good at parenting. You have to actually be good at relationships to be good at parenting. And I just knew from the beginning, when Aaron and Mariah were born, I was like, these are the two human beings God has entrusted me to love and care for and serve. And I see this time in my life as the greatest privilege is to serve them. Yeah.
And even though you called me disrespectful, Pastor Kev, who I love and adore, because you and Pastor Esther are just phenomenal people, and you have such an incredible team, I think there's definitely been a refinement journey, a journey of refinement, where I definitely have learned and developed, I think, so much under you and so much in this ability to ask questions, and you helped me work through my thinking. But I think what shifted maybe in the last few years, and you can definitely disagree with me, was that we kind of had like sat down and really discussed each other's strengths and weaknesses. And one of them being the fact that he refuses to have an ego or an image, or he refuses to kind of build himself, and also at times protect yourself. Mm-hmm. And I was overly protective, and I was someone who always wanted to build you. And so there was maybe like an agreement made, mm-hmm. where if you would just let me cover your weaknesses, you would also cover mine.
Yeah, and we have a great synergy, because even though I'm 65, I'm still pretty crazy. I like moving fast. Yeah. I like taking high risks. Yeah. I love uncertainty.
And I'm definitely more like, let's wait on the Lord.
And so there's this great relationship that we have when we work together. And by the way, I will say this: there were times where Aaron was disrespectful, and I felt it. You ever felt it? You know what I'm talking? You know, you feel it, and you're just like, you're just trying to not like let it own you. Yeah. And when I felt that feeling, you know what I heard, Kevin? I heard, this is the result of your arrogance. That when someone says something, you only are disrespected because you have too high of a view of yourself. So if you have a proper view of yourself and you're disrespected, you go, let's work it out. Let's talk it out. Let's find our way there. And so I actually began, and he doesn't know this, I've never told him this, when he would irritate me and I felt disrespected, I would use it as a monitor of my own internal arrogance. And I would say, all right, when I get rid of that, I'll have found a level of humility that I really want in my life. And so then when someone else disrespects me, it's like it's water off my back. It doesn't even bother me because I care about his respect.
Oh, I would like to use the word friction instead of disrespect. Because a lot of it came on the podcast the reason why I wanted to ask you questions is because I was the only, I would watch you sit in these question and answering sessions, these Q&A sessions, and you would always, you're like a killer whale. You like to play with your food and before you kill it. And you would never answer the question.
And I'm trying to answer the question, and you just don't like my answers.
And I am a lot more pragmatic and maybe utilitarian, and I ask a lot of yes and no questions. And he always finds a way to get out of the yes and no question.
No, it makes me mad. No. Because he said you're not answering the question. I am answering the question, but you want me to be linear, and I'm like more organic, and it takes me a while to get there.
This morning at breakfast, what would you like to talk about today? Oh, yeah. Well, what? Oh, you know.
Whatever you want to talk about.
I think in his mind, he's answering me. And then no, Dad, I have the notes. We're going to run through the flow. I'm going to go get fruit. We're at breakfast. Okay, so we're going to talk about fruit. But I'll ask questions and you'll build the world around it. And so I knew as a son that I could maybe pull something out of you that someone else, you wouldn't let someone else pull out of you.
Yeah, and so I never feel like you disrespect me. I actually feel that you disagree with me, you try to dissect me, even when I'm alive, you're doing an autopsy. And
I look at it as I work in a mine. I just get to dig.
And what I've realized is when I let him guide the conversation, we finally get to the answer people need. And I'm not that good at that. Because if you ask me, what's your favorite place in the world? I'll say, well, there's so many worlds.
This one, this world,
And
the one on Google Maps.
And he'll reprimand me, even in the car afterwards, going, Dad, you need to answer their question. And I'll tell myself, yeah, answer the question.
Yes, like yesterday, the unstoppable force question.
Okay, the first question we got was if I could write a new version of Unstoppable Force.
Which is your first book.
My first book.
Yes.
Well, what would you do?
And you
I answered the question.
abused that man.
I did not abuse him. I just said,
He's shaking his head yes in the background.
I love questions.
Right.
And I think that there is more truth behind the question than in front of the question. I'll let you think about that.
Yeah.
We only have 30 seconds left.
You're not getting out of this. But why is it that it's hard for you to answer questions?
I think questions are so limiting.
To what?
See, most people ask you a question and they want you to
Give you an answer?
to fill in a blank.
Yeah.
And I actually think that we should be more like Jesus.
Don't do that at the end.
And ask the question behind the question so that we can all be elevated together. I think our time is up.
Okay. Yeah.
I've loved doing this with you.
I do. I love doing this with you.
And I want to thank Pastor Kevin and Esther and
Yes.
all of you for allowing us to bring Mindshift to KL and to Collective.
Thank you guys so much. Appreciate it.
Come on, let's give
Have a great.
Erwin and Erwin
Thank you.
McManus a big hand.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and don't forget to order the 7 Frequencies of Communication right now, the7frequencies.com. And one thing I'll tell you is that this book is best done with a friend. So if it's your spouse, your girlfriend, your situationship, or your entire team, I want to make sure that you have every opportunity to do this in community and do this with someone and engage on how you communicate and how you listen to other communicators. Buy the book right now, the7frequencies.com.